Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like these. Now, let's get into today's story video. My 29 male, ex-fiancé 29 female, cheated on me 4 years ago. I picked myself up and came back stronger than ever. This occurred a while back, but I thought I'd post it in the hopes of telling those whose lives have been shattered by infidelity that their world is not over, and that things can only get better from here on out. Disclaimer: names and other information have been modified to protect people's identities. I met my ex-fiancée, let's call her Jane, at a coffee shop 7 years ago. I was standing behind her in a lengthy, slow-moving line when we began conversing. We hit it off right away and even sat and drank coffee for nearly an hour together. We ultimately exchanged phone numbers before parting ways. I was cautious to get serious with her at first, since I had just begun as an analyst at a huge investment bank and the hours were really terrible. Think 70-80 hours a week when things were sluggish, and up to 120 plus when we were working on live transactions. I'd also heard numerous relationship horror tales from my younger colleagues about how all of their relationships had collapsed as a result of the long hours and inability to see their so's on a regular basis. After a few dates with Jane, though, it was evident that I was falling for her and that she felt the same way about me. I expressed my fears about my work hours causing our relationship to fail, and she informed me that she genuinely loved me, that it would be a pity if we didn't even try, and that any storm could be weathered if we remained dedicated and were understanding towards one another. She kept her promise, and the following 3 years were filled with Everest-like highs and horrible lows, but we persisted. She was kind and understanding, and she never made me feel bad about staying up late at work rather than with her. She lavished me with love, care, and compassion, and often expressed her gratitude to be with such an outstanding person as me. In exchange, I did all in my power to love her as she deserved to be loved. To everyone's amazement, we were stronger than ever at the conclusion of this 3-year period, whereas all of my other analyst relationships had shattered and burned. During this time, I felt it was time to start recruiting for private equity opportunities. If I am successful, my hours will be considerably decreased, and my already ridiculously high income will be increased much more. I also determined that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Jane, this incredible lady who had stood with me even through my bad junior banking years. While we were on vacation in Spain, I purchased a ring and proposed to her. When she said yes, I was overjoyed. This is the point at which everything turns to **. She was in the bathroom one day when she realized she had left her phone on the bedside table. I felt the smallest desire to snoop. At this time, she had done nothing that would cause me to assume she was cheating, and I had no inklings that anything was amiss. I'd only had a passing hankering, and it's not like she'd ever find out I'd snooped. Long story short, I snooped and discovered a named female I didn't recognize in her conversations. I clicked in, and what I saw both infuriated and crushed my heart. Lots of sweet nothings, nudes, and so on. They even sent me SMS comparing the size of my erection to his. What made matters worse was that he seemed to be taller and more attractive than me. I'm 5'9" and barely slightly over average in terms of appearance. I was trembling so violently and felt so terrible that I hung up the phone and walked outside to take a break. My mind was racing as I walked down the street. My initial thinking was that it was my fault, that she simply wanted to be loved, and that I couldn't give her the attention she needed because of my job. Sad, right? I wanted to confront her when I came home, but I was terrified since I loved her so much, and confronting her may damage our relationship. My thoughts raced from, hey, this isn't that horrible, right? It's just a couple of messages. It's not like they had. You just have to put in a little more effort, and she'll love you again, to how dare she do something so vile to you behind your back. I eventually determined that I needed additional evidence before making a choice, as if the texts weren't sufficient. I went out and got a little camera, which I put amid some other items on a shelf in the corner of our bedroom. I turned it on the following day before heading to work. Later that night, at 10 p.m., I triggered the camera and saw precisely what I had hoped not to see, but was expecting to see: her being railed by the person she was messaging on her phone. All aspirations of reconciliation and whatever remaining affection I had for her were suddenly dashed. I puked in the bathroom and ran out the door to my closest friends, let's call him Owen Place, where I broke down and wept harder than I had ever cried in my 25 years of life. After I had cooled down, Owen and I drank thick scotch and discussed my next step after I had finished ranting. We spoke all night until we both had to go for work the following morning. He advised that instead of confronting Jane and ending my engagement, I'd be courteous around her until I got a new job, ideally in private equity, and a new apartment, then block her phone, email, and all forms of social media, etc., and move out while she's at work. I'd be kissing her goodbye in the morning, and the next thing I knew, I'd be gone, as if I never lived. He warned me that it would strike her like a truck. I was completely on board with this idea, but I informed him that I'd like to go to a different continent, most likely New York, where I'd be completely gone. He told me he'd miss me if I did, but if that's what I needed, he backed my choice. Later that day, I dragged into work like a zombie, but the tremendous weight that had been dragging me down had been significantly removed. The following month was the most terrible I'd ever had to face. Being near Jane whenever I was at home was brutally agonizing, as did pretending to be normal. I couldn't look her in the eyes without wanting to hurt her physically, but I was able to put on a brave front and be loving towards her. We even had a couple sessions, which left me feeling disgusted and weak. She had informed everyone that we were engaged, and when she mentioned the wedding, I lied and said that we would have to wait a few months since things were heating up at work and I would be quite busy. I delivered the same response to the swarms of common friends and relatives who had called to congratulate us. I sobbed a couple times in the office toilet late at night, knowing she was probably sleeping with AP at the time. It was a marvel that I was able to keep going for as long as I did. It helped me to remain at the workplace as late as feasible or to just roam about the city when I ended earlier than normal. Meanwhile, I was reaching out to headhunters in New York in the hopes of recruiting for private equity associate positions there while also preparing for their LBO modeling exams. I'd also informed my other close pals what I was planning to do, and they all said they'd be there for me no matter what. I had a few interviews lined up with New York-based private equity firms after a few weeks of interviews with headhunters. Everything was going just as planned, but this isn't a dream world, this is reality, and life soon threw me a curveball that utterly smashed my plan, but not in the manner you may imagine. One Friday night, I went out with Owen and another of my pals, let's call him Antoine, and we ended up socializing with a bunch of individuals Antoine knew. One of the most gorgeous females I'd ever seen was among them. I chatted to her for a while and we got along well. Her name was Alyssa, and she was from Sweden. She was very gorgeous and looked like Elsa Hosk. She was an Elsa Hosk's exact twin. You know who was Elsa and who was Alyssa if you place them both side by side, but you understand what I mean. We had a lot in common, including the fact that she was pursuing her master's degree at my alma mater and, in fact, was pursuing the same program as I was, and that we had both grown up in Asia. I was going to go to New York right away, but I couldn't stop myself from exchanging phone numbers with her. We eventually went on a couple dates and slept together. I'd never felt so desired and understood by anybody before, not even Jane at the beginnings of our relationship. And for the first time in weeks, I felt really content. We shared our innermost sentiments with each other one night after sleeping together. She said how her ex cheated on her, I didn't urge her, and how she despised and had no regard for infidels. I then detailed my present condition to her, and she laughed, not at me, but in amazement and astonishment at how I was about to bash Jane. She then asked if there was any way I might remain instead of going to New York. I replied I'd think about it, but deep down, I didn't want to go. I had no intention of becoming connected with anybody, but Alyssa was so lovely that I couldn't help but fall for her. Her beliefs on infidelity also convinced me that she would never betray me in such a heinous manner as Jane did if we ended up together. She threw a huge curveball. Some may argue that I'm cheating on Jane and that I'm now as bad as she is. I disagree with the former since she cheated first, thus I had no need to be true to her after that. I agree with him. I'm a barbarian. Stay tuned for the next part.